Welcome, and thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Brigitte Blacher, Program Manager at the Smithsonian Associates, the world's most expansive museum-based education program that's now streaming. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are so glad that you've chosen to spend your time with us, and we look forward to welcoming you to many more programs in the future. And to our members and donors, thank you for your ongoing generosity, especially during these challenging times. You can find out more about our upcoming programs on our website, smithsonianassociates.org, as well as on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You'll see links in the chat box, and that's where we'll be posting resources throughout the program. So take a minute to find it on your toolbar. While you're there, make sure you also find the Q&A box so you can pose questions to our special guests throughout the evening. You may also notice that our program also includes closed captioning. You may choose to hide that option by clicking on the icon on your toolbar. This device is a little different on every device. It's every different. So please let us know if you need any help by messaging us through the Q&A box. Finally, please take a minute to complete the exit survey you'll see after the program. We appreciate and value your feedback and read every comment. Tonight's program is so appropriate as we celebrate the end of Women's History Month and the beginning of Jazz Appreciation Month. To learn more about our History Film Forum, our partners for this monthly jazz film series, and Jazz Appreciation Month, and even see the fabulous poster for this year's jazz celebration, you'll see the links that are included in the chat. We would also like to thank Dan Manatt and the Democracy Films for their generous support of these programs. And now I am honored to introduce our moderator, Fath Davis Ruffins. Fath is the curator of African American History and Culture at Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. She is a specialist on African American culture, history, and on ethnic imagery in advertising and popular entertainment. She has curated and consulted on major African American exhibits at the Smithsonian and elsewhere. She has published widely on the history of how African Americans have preserved and presented their own history from the early 1800s to today. Welcome to the Zoom stage, Fath Davis Ruffins.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm very happy to be here with you and to be able to talk about this marvelous film. I'm going to introduce our two commentators, people who worked on the film, director and an executive director, and then we'll just go to conversation. First, let me introduce Yoruba Richen. She is, her work has been featured on PBS, MSNBC, FX, New York Times, OpDoc, Frontline, The Atlantic, and Field of Vision. Her other recent films include The New York Times Presents The Killing of Breonna Taylor, which won an NAACP Image Award and is currently streaming on Hulu. And also The Sit-In. Harry Belafonte hosts The Tonight Show, which is streaming on Peacock. Also tonight we have Lacey Schwartz Delgado, who is an award-winning writer, director, producer, storyteller, and outreach strategist, who uses the power of narratives to build community and impact change on a personal, familial, institutional, and societal level. She is a sought-after speaker and is best known for writing and directing and producing her nationally and internationally recognized personal documentary, Little White Lie. Hello, Yoruba and Lacey. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Hi there. Hi there. Thank you.
Film.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here and in conversation with both of you.
Yes. So first of all, let me ask, since I have read the book that Ruth Feldstein wrote, and it's in the chat, it gives you the information about the book, which is a marvelous scholarly study, of which, you know, there are lots of scholarly books. What made you think this could be a film?
Oh, it's so cool that you've read the book. So you really know what we did in terms of how to make this a film. So I read the review of the book in, I guess it was early 2014. And as soon as I read the review, so even before I read the book, as soon as I read the review, I was like, whoa, this is a really interesting take, a really interesting analysis about these women that I've never seen before. And this would make a great documentary. And so I immediately reached out to Professor Feldstein, even again, before I read the book. And I was like, hey, I'm about to read this book. I'm a filmmaker. This is like amazing. Would you think about this as a film? And so we started, our conversation, and I read the book. And what you said is a key word there, that it's a very scholarly book, which it is. It doesn't have interviews. It is really about the analysis of these women, and how they reshape representation, how their work was political, both on screen and off screen. And for me, what I saw in terms of a film is that not only that the take was really interesting, but also that there was an incredible wealth of archive of these women, right? There are stories that maybe maybe you've heard some of them, maybe not for a contemporary audience. So it's a name that you may have heard of, but understanding them in a new way. And then also setting up that these women were the trailblazers who set up what we have now finally starting to see, I should say, in terms of Black storytelling and Black women's storytelling specifically. These women fought the fight, in the beginning, and there's a clear path to what they did, and where we are today. And so I thought that that was very contemporary as well. And so that's why I wanted to make it a film.
Thank you so much for being in conversation with us here tonight, and thank you for having me. Obviously, to back up everything you were talking about when she first brought us the book, we were really, really excited about it, and I think the contemporary piece of it and how we personally felt connected to it as storytellers, that we really wanted to add that piece in terms of, not just out as people were on stage and screen, but also how now many of us are behind the camera. But seeing that all as part of that narrative. And I think with so many of these women, some women who many were not that familiar with. I can't tell you how many people who have told me that, they weren't that familiar with Abbey Lincoln or her work, right? And one of the things that we also really appreciated about the ability to tell the story is it wasn't just about the successes, it was also about what held them back from doing some of this activism, and also what some of the activism made it harder to do. And so I think it was about the different layers and how it all connected through. And to Yoruba's point, us then being able to bring the interviews in and having current performers talk about what it meant for them. Working with Alicia Keys as one of the executive producers, who, when we connected with her, what was so fascinating was that, similar to the way in which Yoruba had first found the book, she and her team had also found the book and had said, wow, this would make a great film. And so we came to them with it. It had already coincidentally been a spur in their head. So it was really about continuing it and expanding the work that Ruth had done.
That's really fascinating. Very few academic books get made into films, let me just say, even documentaries. So that's really great. Although these women were performers, and so there is performance footage, films and television and other things. And so that does make it more accessible maybe than some other topics. There are some differences between the book and the film. So I'd like you to talk about how you thought about some of those differences. I have some questions, but you all might have some questions. I would like you to just talk about that first. What were your choices and thoughts as you tried to move from one format to another format?
Totally. Well, first, I guess the big one is that I, in the book, one of the women that Ruth profiles includes in this cohort is Miriam Makeba, the great singer and performer Miriam Makeba, who is amazing and makes total sense to include in the cohort. I ended up taking her out and putting in Pam Grier for a number of reasons.
I didn't notice that.
Yes, exactly. One thing is I wanted to really bring it to a contemporary space, as we talked about. I thought that, Pam's story could really bring us, could bridge that gap between where we start in the book and where we start in the film and where we end up. And that her story was actually pretty undertold, if that's a word. But pretty her story was not as well known for her being such a huge star at this particular moment in cinema, and of course, Blaxploitation as a genre is, a fascinating chapter in Hollywood history. So I thought having her in could work for the film and do, and bring us to a different place. And that's one big difference in the book. The other big difference is that there weren't interviews with the women. There were maybe a few quotes here and there, but that's the first thing that, we knew that we had to do is the women who are still with us,
Right.
is to interview the women. And also we wanted the women to tell their own stories as much as possible. So it was interviewing the women who were still with us, their family members like Gail Lamette Buckley, who's written a lot about her mom, Lena Horne. So these are some of the first interviews. And also seeing what the archive showed us, what the archive had in terms of these women talking about their experiences. And that began to structure how we were going to put together the film. And that was quite different than the book.
I was struck by the book and to some degree the film organizes these women in terms of generation. Because Lena Horne is, of course, an older generation. She's pretty much about 20 years older than, say, Cicely Tyson or Abbey Lincoln, Manatt Masaka, or some of the other, Nina Simone.
Oh, you called Abbey Lincoln by her African name. I love that.
Pam, though not young today, was much younger in the 60s, the late 60s and 70s, in which the Blaxploitation films. Pam Greer is basically mentioned once on one page in the book, whereas Miriam Makeba, who is actually the older of that second cohort. She's not as in the same generation with Lena Horne, but she's one of the older women in the Cicely Tyson, Abbey Lincoln, Nina Simone cohort. Is a chapter. I mean, she's an enormous figure and very important in the history of Black power and that kind of thing, and Pan-Africanism. But it's interesting that by bringing in Pam Greer, you get not just the generation of people who were young when she was young, which I would put myself in, but also because the Blaxploitation films have such an impact on hip hop and fashion and other things for younger generations now. I think Pam Grier certainly is a better known figure to the wider public. But it'd be interesting for Lacey and you to just talk a little bit about what you lost and what you gained by making that switch.
Yeah, no, I think you articulated it really well. Another thing that we gain in the film is that it brings us, I had to figure out how the structure of the film, right? It's always structure. How do you structure a film? We're making a film with how we're going to tell the story. And politically, it was important. So the film isn't chronological. Right. It goes back and forth, but the momentum of the politics had to be on a thrust forward. Right. And what Pam, as you said, she's influences not only hip hop today and blaxploitation, but there is a Black power and that we're able to get into Black power also through the story of blaxploitation and through her. And so we're able to, it helps with the arc. So where we start off at the beginning of the film in the 1940s, it can bring us to a different political moment that we've seen in different moments of the film to the 1960s. Now, of course, we lose, the internationalism and Pan-Africanism. We try to tell that a little bit through Abby's story, but certainly that is the case. But, I have to say, and we can, maybe Lacey can talk about this, we pitched this in many different iterations as a feature, as a series,
right.
And
to see where the interest lay.
To see where the interest lay. And certainly if we were able to do a series, we could have included, we always wanted to include other women, right, Lacey? We always knew that these were not the only women to tell this story.
Right. They are some of the more prominent, but there are other women.
Right. And I think, in going back to also what we said, I mean, obviously we made the decision to put Pam in quite a few years before, but also part of the issue of how to tell the story. Also, it was also when we were making it, right? Like we started making this film in 2015 and finished it in 2020, and so when you look at what had happened politically over those times, even for us, and how do you capture that, right? How do you capture those moments? And I think that more and more we felt like, one of the things we also really liked is the idea of telling parts of people's stories that they hadn't heard before. I mean, it was almost shocking to me that after watching this film, people would say, I didn't realize that Nina Simone was an activist. Which, when I think of Nina Simone, I've always thought of her that way, but it's amazing to see how many people could have had a different perception, just, I guess, out of what was the kind of the mainstream image, and the mainstream coverage of her. So I think that there was also a way in which we really wanted multiple sides to these women that you hadn't necessarily thought about before. And I think that the way in which, when you look at this finished film and the way in which talking about blaxploitation and Pam Grier's take on it, right? Not just what has also been some of the, that's the other thing about looking at some of these issues. It's these issues through these women's experiences, and not just through analyzing them separate from that. And I think so often we have seen issues analyzed outside of the perspective of the women who a lot of times were going through it. We really wanted to have that multiple level of analysis and through their own words, their own experience. Because oftentimes, as obviously I feel like you could tell us even more so, these women have been defined by others in all sorts of different ways. And we were very interested in exploring that through their own words.
That's fascinating. Yes. I mean, some of the women had passed on by the time the film starts, but Pam Greer is one of the people who's alive and can speak to her own experience. I also thought that it was very fascinating and should be very appealing to audiences today that you brought in contemporary artists to speak about their responses. If you want to talk about that a little bit, that'd be very interesting.
Yeah,
you mentioned Alicia Keys, but there are others.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was always one of the, one of the things that we knew we wanted to do in the film because of how we felt these women's stories spoke to the contemporary moment. So we knew we had to interview contemporary women. I mean, Halle Berry was one of the first people first person on our list. She was like a dream goal, and she was, graciously agreed to be interviewed. Speaking of how long it took for production. So in 2015, no one had really heard of Lena Waithe, right? But by the time we made the film, we were in production finishing the film. Lena was somebody that was on the top of our list because she is such an amazing creator and is, writes, directs, produces, showrunners, and is an actor. So it was always, it evolved for sure, but it was always important to have those contemporary actors who, could talk about how these women laid the groundwork for their career.
And I think it also reflected us and how we felt about it. I mean, when we talked about making the film a lot and our connection to these women, that was one of the things we loved. I mean, when you hear, obviously when you hear somebody like Halle's speech from the Oscars, right? And she was doing that. And so many of these women had done that, that bringing that in and actually helping people understand that when we're thinking about all different ages, we're thinking about audience, right? For the book and actually the movie. As you said, the book was much more of an academic book originally, and we wanted to obviously take what we thought was amazing property and also expands the audience, and thinking about how to make that relevant to the audience of today was for them to see how that had in fact influenced many of the people that they're looking up to. I think Lena Waithe is a perfect example, and she contributed so many great comments and great lines. And it was so interesting also, and I think amazing, and somebody like Lena Waithe shows us, is how much they themselves have been studying the history, have really been inspired by it. So to hear them be able, there's nothing I love more as a filmmaker when you can have somebody who not only has a personal connection, but also knows the history and can connect those two things together.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the people on the chat said, what about Eartha Kitt? Now, of course, she's not in the book, but
well, when it was she was definitely one of our women in our series idea, for sure. I mean, it's, we can go on and on. Josephine Baker was another one that we wanted to include. Yeah.
Someone even older really than Lena Horne, or
exactly.
A little bit older.
Yeah, even more of a, older than Lena Horne, broke through earlier. So yes, you're absolutely right. Eartha Kitt we wanted, if it was a series, we would have included her.
Right. Well, lots of people want you to do a series. So, but of course it probably, for a lot of documentary films, it takes a long time to produce because it takes a long time to raise the money. So it'd be interesting for you to talk a little bit about the process, the behind the scenes process of getting the film produced.
Well, I'll just say that when I when I read the book, when I had the idea, I thought it was fundable. I thought there's no way this is going to take. Yeah, this is easy. I will say that when we started meeting with people, one of the first places that we went to was PBS and American Masters. We were introduced through CPB folks, and they were very, from the beginning, very supportive, very interested in the idea, and in helping us get this made. So that early support was crucial. We also had some funding from Black Public Media as well. So the PBS universe was very supportive of this film, but we did have to find the production funding. We had development funding from Black Public Media, American Masters, ITVS as well. But we needed the production funding, which is a big chunk of money. And the places that I had gone to before previously in terms of the grants, did not, we didn't get funding through that. So, Lacey.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting what you were, and suggesting also is this idea of, do people want to, outside of as you said, the PBS universe was very, very supportive and immediately got it. Do other people want to, fund historical documentaries? And what is the market for that? And so we were taking this film to a lot of places and exploring a lot of really, I think, creative kind of, and PBS, I have to say, I give them all the credit in the world because they were super open to, especially the American Masters, exploring all of these different potential partnerships to really it was all about expanding the universe, but there was also a way in which the film had to get done. This wasn't something we could churn out in 3 months' time. We needed, a decent amount of time to do it. And so we ended up actually meeting some Canadian producers who had done a lot of great work. We had met them through another film program and started talking about the work we were working on. They became really interested in it. And we were able to therefore partner together with their production company and turn it into a also a Canadian production, which was wonderful with, and they had actually, the great thing is they had also worked with American Masters before. And so they already had that relationship as well. So when we met them and they said, oh, we've worked with them, and so it just immediately became something where they were then able to bring that in. We then were able to bring in the international piece with Fremantle. And so we've been able to now do this like US, Canadian, and then an international partnership that has really just expanded the audience. It just, the film has now started showing around the world, just showed in the UK. And so, one of the things I think, and it's interesting because we were talking about, the Miriam Makeba story and the global piece of that, which we think about a lot. And although we did really focus on these American women, we brought in Canadian women to commentate and speak on this. And we really, some of the interviews in the film, but I think that even in the last year in particular, you're seeing how people understand that there's a global perspective to the story nonetheless, right? I mean, when you have so many people looking at like the Black liberation stories in the United States for inspiration, for education, for all of these things, I think it's been actually showing quite well internationally, and we're getting a really great response with that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Just to pick up the PBS piece, of course, in recent weeks, I think it's weeks, a big letter that I believe you signed, Yoruba, has been sent to PBS, suggesting that they really need to think about diversity in a more complex way, and that there's been an over-reliance perhaps on certain filmmakers. Ken Burns might be one. And I'd just like you to comment on that.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And I did sign the letter, along with many other filmmakers who have been supported, filmmakers of color who've been supported by PBS. I mean, the way that I look at this, PBS has been, my career, I owe to PBS, my first two films. So I know the support and that they give to filmmakers, newer filmmakers, and I'm incredibly, grateful for that. But I also think that it's about, when you're in a relationship with someone, you also hold them accountable too, right? And so I think that that there is an over-reliance on certain filmmakers in terms of hours that are given and support that's given, and that needs to be looked at. And that's what the letter is demanding. Let's look at how many hours that filmmakers of color are getting in terms of the bandwidth of PBS versus white filmmakers. And I think that kind of introspection with PBS is really necessary and good that it's happening. And the head of PBS said that yes, her response to the letter was, yes, we need to look at this and we look forward to meeting you. And so I hope meeting with the group. And so I hope that happens. And I hope that we are able to continue a dialogue about this issue. Every place, a lot of places, a lot of institutions are having the racial reckoning that's long needed, and need to reevaluate what their support for filmmakers of color are, and how the narrative that has been around historically in Hollywood, right? We talk about that in How It Feels to Be Free, but in documentary as well, has to continue. It is changing. It has continued to change. And these institutions that we love also need to be held accountable.
Well, I did feel it was very interesting that one of the Asian American filmmakers noticed that she had spent 5 hours presenting Asian American history of 150, 200 years, but that Hemingway, who was coming up in April, got 6 hours just on that one person. So now, of course, Hemingway may be a very important American writer. I wouldn't say that he isn't, but that does show you that there is some kind of a perhaps imbalance about that. Do you have any comments you want to make, Lacey, on that?
No, I mean, I'm okay about it. I just think that, well, this is the last thing I'll just say is I think that it is looking at it from all angles. And I think, especially coming out of How It Feels to Be Free, looking at who's behind the camera, in all forms, both in the creative, part of the crew, not only the cast, right, which is a lot of what we looked at, but just all of these different spaces. Who are the execs that are making these decisions? I mean, it really, really does matter. And I think to your last point, what is looked at as classic American stories, classic American literature, movies, all of these things is just really critical.
Well, we do have some questions. One of them is about the word or the notion of the archives. Now, the archives is a concept that a lot of academics and creative people use. And of course, we don't mean any singular archives, but it's a concept. This person asks, did you have access to any of the personal archives of the women who were featured? And sort of what do you mean by the archive?
Yeah, a great question. I will say, just to premise, in the 5 years that it took to make How It Feels to Be Free, when I had this idea, I'd never made an archival or historical film before. In the 5 years that I took to make How It Feels to Be Free, I made 2 historical films, one about the Green Book and a film about, which was shown on the Smithsonian Channel, right. And a film about Harry Belafonte, and when he took over the Tonight Show. This all prepared me archive-wise for How It Feels to Be Free. So things have a way of working out. So in terms of the last part of your question, we did not have access to the personal archives, but we also didn't necessarily need it, because this was not, as you see, it was not a biography of these women. Right. It was not a birth to death where we got into their, personal relationships, family. For the most part, we did not tell. That wasn't the story we were telling. And for me, that liberated me as a filmmaker to really talk about these women's impact and how their legacy and how they as I've said, how they set up what we see today in terms of Black storytelling, and did not have to focus on the biography of this happened in this year, then this, then this, then this. And quite frankly, I feel that sometimes when our stories are told by not by us, the focus can be on biography, and it can focus on the tragedy. And that's been my critique of a lot of biographies of our people that are done not by us. But in terms of the archive, when we say the archives, we're talking about photos, we're talking about footage, obviously, we're talking about historical footage that can tell the story. In a historical film, you want the archive and the footage to tell the story as much as possible. So you have to do a very deep dive into what's out there. One thing that I learned from making my first film is that it's very hard to find footage of African Americans before like 1960s. So there are no Lena Horne interviews that we found of her in the 40s or 50s that are on video. The scene where we talk about Adam Clayton Powell holding the hearings about racism in the industry in 1962. He had, Sidney Poitier, Diahann Carroll, very big stars, no footage. So the archive is a beautiful thing of what you can discover. And then it's also a very frustrating thing because of what the powers that be were and weren't interested in, at the time. And as I said, it's hard to find, footage of us before a certain time period. So that makes it challenging.
And one other thing to consider also, just as a more of kind of the things that we don't even think about, is because we were editing this film during COVID, All of I mean, obviously we've all had our own personal stories of how the pandemic has affected our lives, but the little ways in which obviously it shut down shooting, right, in a lot of ways. But for us, it was also the archive, the access to the archive.
Yeah.
These archival houses, just like everybody else, were working remotely, working from home. Not all of this stuff is digitized, you know, communicating in that way to get those rights and get that footage. I mean, usually you're going in and you're going into more spaces to do that research, and not being in a position where you could do that also affected the access that we had and the ability we had even to negotiate some of the rights to this stuff. So it was a really, you know, thinking about stuff like archive, which obviously I mean, somebody like myself, we think a lot about the preservation of footage. And to Yoruba's point, I mean, you know, there's some stuff that was never recorded, but then there's also stuff that's not being preserved, and where is it being preserved? Has it been digitized? Those were all additional challenges during COVID and trying to get the film and get access to what we needed, because we might have even had like a temp tape of something and what needed like a higher resolution of archive. Yeah.
And then there's also the expense of the archive. I mean, that is very, very challenging for filmmakers. You know, a lot of the archive houses are bought up by big companies, which charge a lot of money. So that is a real challenge in making historical films.
Yes, absolutely. Another question I'll just pose this. One of the very interesting things in the book, which you see in the film, and I think only Alicia Keys comments on this, is that a number of these women, Miriam Makeba, but also in the film, Abbey Lincoln, Nina Simone, begin to wear their hair in natural styles. And they begin to influence, especially younger women, fashion on the streets. Not necessarily, I'm not talking about influencing high fashion at this point, couture. I'm talking about influencing people who are actually on the streets. And there's a section on the Panthers and women in the Panthers. And I'd just like you to talk a little bit about their influence that goes beyond sort of the film industry, but other ways in which they were influencing people.
Yeah, no, great question. And I'm thinking in terms of I'm thinking back to, in terms of conceptualizing the film, you know, through the years as, you know, moments change and cultural change and things occur to me. One of the things that we began to realize is that it's not just how the women affected the industry, but how they affected the viewers and the audience, and how the audience was interpreting their performances, their fashion, and what that meant for you know, for Black people. And so that's a really important thing, right? You have in early 1960s, Abbey Lincoln wearing her hair natural, shedding her image of
Cicely Tyson also, another person.
Cicely Tyson too.
I love that clip with Cicely Tyson and James Earl Jones, where he's
exactly, wearing her hair natural on TV in her short afro in the late 50s, early 60s. So these were groundbreaking. I mean, our hair is always political, right? Our hair is, our skin color, always political. I mean, that's just the nature of our experience in this country. So these women were some of the earliest, and there were others too, you know, who were owning their Blackness, and it was a political statement. And that was a radical thing to do, and risky as well.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, the fashion as well, right? It's like the hairstyles, the fashion, and how so many of these women, I mean, that's one of the things when we first started working on the book, looking at activism, and this term activism is used almost loosely. I mean, I do think that there is a lot of activism that is happening, but what does that mean? I know for myself, as like a storyteller, I ask myself all the time, like, am I an activist? And I think that one of the things that really interests me is looking at activism through a lot of different lenses. It's not just showing up at a political rally. It's not just what you say about a political topic. It's also the roles you choose, how you wear your hair, the clothes you wear, all of these different things, what you don't do at times. And I think, one of the things we haven't talked about that much, but then that one of my favorite things about the film is talking about it from different angles, right? How on one hand, when you look at something like Julia, right, that could have been looked at as activism, but also Diahann Carroll got a lot of backlash from that, even within the Black community. So I think that there's multiple layers to these decisions, and I think we wanted to look at activism and the potential backlash of it on a lot of different levels. And I think one of the things that for me, as a Black woman, that I really connect to is seeing all parts of ourselves. One of my favorite lines in the film is when Lena Waithe says, when we're telling our own stories, we get to be the heroes and the villains. And I think that that's one of the things that this film does, is it really looks at it. And I love the way in which, I find Diahann Carroll has some comments about it where she says, it's almost, she's self-reflective, almost self-critical at moments, and saying like, well, I can have this success because I have, I can adhere to certain standards of beauty, but she's also pointing that out as a problem in society. And I think that's one of the reasons we put in a bunch of stuff about skin color as well, and skin tone, that, we have to have all of these conversations, because these are the conversations that we're having in our spaces, and it all has to be included. It's not just, as Yoruba said earlier, it's not just the positive piece.
Yes, I think the complexities, one of the complexities that you're able to elaborate on is that by having women in different generations with very different, even internal to African American communities, different ideas about what was appropriate or inappropriate, or what was beautiful or not beautiful, you see these women navigating these different kinds of styles. In the film, much more than in the book, you do look at some of the earlier people, such as Hattie McDaniels and others who are in Hollywood. And of course, she is the first Black woman to win an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress in Gone with the Wind. And in an earlier generation, she actually was considered a very powerful figure because she was not retiring. She was a very dominant figure in the film. In, yes, the role of the loyal servant, but was a dominant figure in the film, which to an earlier generation was very powerful. One question someone in the chat asked is, what were the relationships, or you point to some of the difficulties that some of these women had with the earlier performers who perhaps they felt that these people were not, that they had underlined or underscored certain stereotypical ideas about African Americans, which these people, even Lena Horne, for example, who was a pinup girl. Okay, so she was not the large woman in the kitchen. She was a sultry star that many men. My father was a World War II veteran. Many men in her generation found very sexy and appealing, and that this was very different than these earlier roles. So it'd be interesting for you to comment on these, because some of these women feel this way about some of the people that you talk about. Diahann Carroll is a fascinating figure, and when she gets to talk about being on television and playing the villain, she loves it. So just commenting on those generational issues.
When I discovered that Lena Horne, who had this groundbreaking contract where she refused to pay maids, right? So Gone with the Wind comes out, Hattie McDaniels wins in like 1938, I believe, right?
Well, I think the film comes out in 49, so she probably wins in 40, something like that.
Comes out, like 39, I think it's 39, I think it's 1939.
Yeah.
And then Lena's contract is like 42, so it's like 2 years later, right? And she refuses to play, she negotiates this contract where she refuses to play a maid or a person in the jungle, as her daughter says. Yes. And groundbreaking, right? Groundbreaking. And yet she pisses, and it's celebrated in the Black press, it's a huge thing, yet she gets backlash from the folks in Hollywood the Black
Yes.
folks in Hollywood who'd been playing those maids and servants, and because they say if she refuses to do it, well, what does it say about what we've done, and will there be any more roles anymore if she's
Right.
refusing to do it? It's a livelihood issue, because
Right.
there are Black people who have been in Hollywood since the beginning.
Since the beginning.
Telling, so in those roles. So that is fascinating. But then on the other side of it, right, Lena, they don't know what to do with her.
Right.
Because she
It doesn't help her in some ways.
Is that right? It doesn't, she
They don't know what to do with her.
If they're not going to play, if she's not going to play a maid, then what do they do with her? So she had, only 1 or 2 roles were speaking parts. And they cut her out of the scenes for the South.
Yeah,
so
mostly
she
she was
realized-
singing.
Exactly. And she was
in a role they could cut out.
Exactly. And so she couldn't be with the white people, and she couldn't be with the Black people. And she said, I was stuck in the middle, this gray thing. And she realized pretty quickly that Hollywood wasn't, it wasn't ready for her. Yeah.
No.
So there's, and Lacey mentioned Diahann with her critique, again, groundbreaking role on Julia, but got a lot of critique, which, we talk about in the film, was shown in the film, backlash from Black people. It's not realistic enough. With Nina Simone, when she sings for women, Black radio stations don't want to play her.
Right.
So it's always that tension. And of course, the tension with Blaxploitation, where you have Cicely Tyson speaking out against Blaxploitation.
Right.
So it's all those forces that I think is just fascinating.
It's a complex story. It's not a simple story.
No.
That you're trying to tell. And I think by having these, I'll just call them chapters, these different women are in different chapters of the story, you get a fuller picture of the issues in trying to have a career, trying to be ambitious, trying to be as successful as possible, but also dealing with issues of representation. Now, it's a little bit different maybe with Abbey Lincoln, because she's in the jazz genre, and jazz, though highly masculinist, which is really comes out in the book, is that straight what we think of as bebop and straight ahead jazz was a very had heavily masculine content to it, and so she's navigating. Cicely Tyson too are navigating those worlds. But Cicely didn't sing, whereas Abbey Lincoln is singing. But doing that, she too gets blackballed, she says directly. And then Cicely Tyson says she didn't get offered a lot of roles. She would have a 1 movie, and then maybe years would go by, and she didn't get a lot of roles offered. So there are prices to pay. And the book and the film make clear, as these women talk about their experiences, there are prices to pay for the choices that they made,
And that's
that were able to make.
And that's one of the things that, I personally think about as a creator, the fact that they are making sacrifices, but still sticking to those choices. Still that idea of, and obviously as a title suggests, the whole concept of freedom and how it feels to be free as a Black woman, when the essentialization of that identity is happening over and over and over again, where people are telling you, this is what it is to be a Black woman, this is what it is to be a Black woman. And there's actually a million ways to be a Black woman.
Right,
and you're
right.
trying, and half the time, like all other human beings, you're trying to remember who you are, you're trying to be who you are, you're trying to carve that path. And so look at these women who made those choices, and especially within Hollywood, right? That is so often telling you, this is how you should be, this is what it should be, this is what people want. And to have to stick to your sense of self, that is, that courage, and that's obviously we could have a whole conversation about what is freedom and how does it feel to be free. But these are just a bunch of women and so many others who were constantly making those choices in spite of the fact that they were being oftentimes punished for them, or having to risk things for it.
Well, I'm reading down here in the chat to see if there are any more questions here. Oh, what was the most enjoyable part of making the documentary? And what was the most challenging part of making the documentary?
Well, challenging, I will say, is kind of what we discussed, was figuring out how to raise the money to make it. That was challenging, but it was also challenging creatively and you know, it's kind of this the answer is the same to both questions. Creatively, it was challenging because it's not 6 women, not a biopic. Didn't want it to be just chronological. Never wanted it to just, you know, be chronological in time. So figuring out that structure was definitely a nut to crack. Definitely nut to crack.
And in certain ways, especially with in the beginning, honestly, the archival is kind of mesmerizing. And so there's a part of it that just like, you almost want to watch it all raw. So how do you also choose when there's so much good stuff from all of these women and more? How do you make those choices? I also think, to Rewer's point about structure, is like every one of these women could have a film just about them.
Just about
exactly.
them.
Yeah.
You know, and so how do you remember what the story is? How do you figure out all of that? I mean, that was also the fun part, I think. But
Yeah, exactly. In some ways it was also because I knew it fit together. I knew it, but it was just figuring out how.
in 2 hours.
In 2 hours.
In 2 hours. Yes, right. In 2 hours. Yes. Well, a couple of people in the chat are saying, do a series, do a sequel, whatever. Of course, you know, that has a lot to do with money and access and a lot of other things that we probably can't solve in this particular thing. Any one of these women could be an American master, particularly those who have left us, going to their, as my mother would say, greater reward. But what if you were to do another film is somewhat similar? Where would you go next? What would be the, you know, you've gone to a certain horizon. What would be beyond that horizon? If brains was to say, whether you get to do it or not, what would be your next steps?
Well, for me personally, there are definitely other figures in the entertainment world who I think would be amazing stories. I think they bring out different issues. They may be more contemporary, but I love telling stories. I grew up in the theater. I'm someone who loves telling stories about our amazing entertainers. I said I just did a film last year about Harry Belafonte and his work. So I think there's just artistically, there are other figures that, you know, I think would be really fascinating to tell their stories. So that's, if I would do something similar, it wouldn't be similar in that, but I mean, our entertainers, there's such a slew of stories, you know, there really are.
And I think that, you know, one of the things that, again, really strikes me about this film is this idea of doing this story told from the collectivity of being Black women, that, you know, and zoning into one issue, but still being able to get into the specifics. Because I think for, you know, in our work, a lot of times you really don't want to, I don't want to say like all Black women are this way. It's really just opening the questions and opening the journey for the audience to kind of look at those things and ask themselves, how do I relate to that? How do I connect to that? And I think that, you know, and we're already talking about a bunch of projects that, you know, that I think open up the door to that, into looking at an element of somebody's identity. Like in this one, it was about being performers on and off, being activists on and off the stage or screen for performers, you know, and so there's other kind of identities that people could have, and how do you then look at the individuality within those identities? And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting to us as well.
Well, it's interesting because in the book, she frames her, she limits the universe, since she can't write about everything all the time, right? She limits the universe to women who share this New York experience in the particularly 50s, 60s, and 70s. and that's part of the reason I think probably Pam Greer is not in the book. Miriam Makeba is a very important figure in those sort of politically active, bohemian, black arts movements of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Someone like Pam Grier, really, I don't know her personal history, but she emerges out of LA.
Yeah.
There's some other women, like when I first started, I thought about Aretha Franklin, but she's not in that New York group. She's, more Chicago and coming more directly out of the church. Many of these people, of course, went to church and were church goers, but she's very much associated with coming not out of the kind of left, politically active Paul Robeson kind of left, very different. Or some other people, for example, of course, Nat Geo has just done, what is it, an 8-part series on Aretha Franklin.
Yeah.
There's a documentary, I understand, it's coming out, I'm not sure who, on Tina Turner and her life. Another person, she's in some of these generations, but not in that New York group. She comes from a different framework,
exactly.
Rural South, and up through a different kind of entertainment structure. So there's certainly many stories. And I think that your film does a great job of showing how these very different women with very different personalities, and to some extent different circumstances in the sense that they're in different generations, are trying to navigate through this world, this very complex world of entertainment and political activism at the same time. I think that it's really useful to point to the way that political activism has many elements. It's not simply going to demonstrations. This would be in the 60s. It's not only filing lawsuits. It's not only doing a narrow range of activities, but it's doing a very wide range of activities because people are looking for culture change. And culture change isn't just legal, and it isn't just formal political activity. It has all these other elements that these women are working on. We're getting close to the end of our time, so if there are any kind of final statements you want to make to our audience, now's the moment.
I just want to say, the thing that I want audiences, I hope audiences will take away from the film, is besides maybe being introduced or reintroduced to some of these women, seeing and hearing their performances, reveling in that delicious, footage that we talked about, but also to see how Black women were at and continue to be at the forefront of the Black freedom struggle, and also cultural innovators as well.
And I'll just close also with saying it's so incredible talking to you. I mean, one of the things is that has been such a gift of doing this project is being able to also tap into so many people who have done so much incredible work in this space. And I think for many of us, I mean, even the undercurrent of making this film is about us coming together and collaborating and working with a great team of people. And so just to continue to expand those conversations and have opportunities where the film can be the starting point to continue that conversation with people who have, like yourself, so much incredible knowledge. It's just like a gift to sit here and listen to you talk about these things. And I think that idea of that we can all build together and we can all learn from people like yourself who've done so much incredible work. So I'm really grateful.
Well,
Yes,
thank
absolutely.
you. Thank you so much. It was absolutely fabulous to see these films, which I watched twice, and to see and to read the book, because it was a pleasure. It wasn't a job. It was a pleasure to do these things, and also to see women who are behind the camera. That's something that Lena Waithe in particular mentions during the film, is that sometimes, Lena Horne, Diahann Carroll, these are people whose whole lives, Cicely Tyson almost, they were in front of the camera, but there was no one behind the camera. Now there are people behind the camera. Maybe they're not as many as there should be, but we can now thank you, who I'm guessing are younger than I am. And so that is wonderful that they're, you know, coming generations who are working, who are doing this work and who are looking back to these people, because that's what history is about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Peace,
so much.
everyone. Thank
Stay
you for
safe.
coming. And I
Thank
think
you.
we have some people to thank. Brigitte?
Oh, we
Bridget.
do. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you, Yoruba, Lacey, and Faith, for a fabulous conversation. I'm dying to go read the book. I went on Amazon, which was in the link, and in the chat, the link to the book. So if you'd like to read it, I will be. And if you have not had a chance to see the film, we have put it also in the chat for you to take a look at and to be able to see the film again, if you like. Otherwise, please go to American Masters, the PBS website, and that you can learn more about the film there. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors again. And please, I ask you, please take our survey before you exit this program. Thank you all again for joining us this evening, and happy Jazz Appreciation Month. Thank you.